I really shouldn't have gotten this cartridge back when it was stolen from me as a kid back in 2005. Under most circumstances, I'd have never seen this game again, but through constant unexpected developments that followed the theft, I'm able to still hold my favorite game ever in my hands like this. And with this newest installment of Mega Man & Chill, I'll take you on a journey, a story of a theft that resulted in the most risky attempt to retrieve what was stolen. It's not a secret to anyone that I've been a Mega Man fanatic ever since I was an elementary student, and I turned 32 years old a month ago, so yeah, I'm one of the old heads in this community. But during the Christmas of 2004, when I was just a 7th grader, I was given the mother of all gifts, and it was the single most unforgettable Christmas morning of my life. 2 boxes. Not all that impressive on first glance, but as I ripped the paper off the bigger of the two, I saw the image of the Game Boy Advance SP on the box. I'm all giddy about this, of course, but before I could get too excited, I went and quickly tore open the second one like a fucking rabies-infested raccoon. My fingers perfectly peeled off the wrapping where those glorious bold letters spelling Mega Man 03 were printed. I didn't see these 2 gifts coming, by the way, because about a month or 2 prior, my normal GBA, you know, the one with an earphone jack, I still love USP, was stolen, along with my copy of Battle Network 3 in it. It was stolen in a completely different way than today's story, and it wasn't even my fault, but story for another time, I guess. Anyway, I touched on this in my Mega Man 03 is very dear to me video, but my parents knew I was a Mega Man fanatic, and I'm assuming they used the previous theft as the perfect opportunity to figure out what to get me for that Christmas. A replacement system and one of the most recent Mega Man installments at the time. I love them both, man. I was bummed out from the previous stuff that Christmas wasn't even on my mind that year, but those 2 gifts instantly raised my spirits, and God was I hooked. I remember spending the whole morning and afternoon on that Christmas day, playing that shit out of 03, man. Hell, even my brother was getting in on it after seeing how much fun I was having. You know, back when we still had somewhat of a functional relationship, and I had no idea I was even a target of his abuse. Since I previously played the Japanese version on an emulator, it technically wasn't a blind playthrough, but being able to understand the story, know what the fuck I was doing with the menus since I could finally read them, and all of that jazz, it made for a wonderful experience. I spent all of my Christmas break just playing at one game, and while I sucked at it, eventually beating it was the most rewarding feeling. So to say I was addicted was an understatement. It got to the point where I eventually just started carrying the thing in my backpack to school as a few months had passed. And you see, that's where I screwed up. Even as a child, I was very guarded about my personal belongings, mainly because I didn't grow up rich and privileged, and my brothers had a big sharing problem. So even with them owning consoles and games, I still needed stuff to call my own, since they didn't want me touching their stuff, and hated having me around in general. Being the youngest in the family sucks sometimes, so I cherished every little thing my parents could afford to give me. This helped warding off the vultures that were the other kids. Stealing was very common in the schools I went to, and I generally tried to be as discreet as possible if I had something that could catch someone's eye. I could be in plain sight, and yet my silly ass tactics could still make them oblivious to what I was up to. A common strategy I used to ward off thieves was to hold up a book and have it faced up while I'm either in the corner or at the back of class. This ranged from textbooks to even novels I had. This worked in my favor with the latter, especially as sometimes I'd genuinely just be reading a book to pass the time if I'm in PE or something. Whether I was reading the book or not didn't matter, because kids would just look at me and be like, "Oh, it's just him reading that nerdy stuff again," and then pay me no mind. Well, excuse me, random kid of the past. I very much liked my nerdy Alosha book, thank you very much. The little shits had no idea I'd be playing my Game Boy in between the pages, with a jacket conveniently in my lap as well to quickly slip it in and out if someone like them or a teacher got too close. The jacket was important because novels were smaller than textbooks, and people could peek over them easier. Keep this jacket in mind, by the way. So all is well. I had good strategies established in order to not draw attention to other kids. It worked on the teachers because they just get annoyed and tell me to put the book away when they were talking about something important in class, which, you know, they're easier on that because they liked it when a kid actually took an interest in books. And my middle school was full of upcoming menaces to society, so my quiet demeanor was welcomed by them. But it all changed when this one kid suddenly started speaking to me more. He was similar to me, quiet, nerdy, not a lot of attention on him. I'm not saying his real name, so let's just call this kid Eric. And that's when it hit me. Oh no, a like-minded kid. That means he's familiar with the tactics. It was all happening so fast that I forgot to slide my Game Boy back into hiding. We were in PE at the time, aka the 1 hour of the day that we could just goof around, and I was lucky because that was the last class every day. Eric saw my Game Boy with a little grin plastered on his face and was like, cool, I got one of those too. I started letting my guard down because, well, okay, crisis averted. Kid's got his own Game Boy. What the fuck would he even need to steal mine for? He kept going on and on about games he's played on the Game Boy, and he seemed real intimate with it. Eric did this throughout the course of a few weeks, which got me more comfortable around him. So, as we're chatting one day, the boys on the court were playing basketball, and they shout out to us, the two nerds, that they needed someone else on their team. Don't know why the hell they even asked two skinny-ass nerds instead of more athletic kids who were lounging about, but whatever. And look, y'all, this is where Eric got me. He got my ass good. Remember that jacket? The kid was bright enough to realize it was where I kept the Game Boy, even on days where I claimed I didn't have it on me. He knew I was lying. Had I not been so disgruntled by the rowdy kids on the court pressuring one of us to come over, I'd have my head screwed on straight enough to pay more attention to Eric. So during my annoyed state, he took advantage of it and gently took my jacket without me thinking too much of it. Eric was like, come on, get on out there, get in the game. You can shoot better than me anyway. So I reluctantly ran onto the court and started shooting the hoops with the boys. And throughout this entire game, it was like a fucking hamster in my head was going overdrive in my brain. Just this feeling of dread washing over me as my senses were finally coming back to me. And I thought to myself, Eric, that little punk. I kept shooting glances at him during the game, for it appeared that he was just sitting next to my jacket and not doing anything suspicious with it. So I thought, okay, cool. Chill out. Maybe he is just looking out for me, because it's 100% confirmed that he knows that the Game Boy is in there, along with Mega Man 03. We became friends within those few weeks. He's just holding it down so nobody could potentially steal it. As soon as the game was over, I'm gonna run over there and swipe that shit as fast as I could, even if he started running, because I know I'm faster than him. Because they forced us to run track every once in a while. I was small but in shape. Eric wasn't. Boy was slow and had bad stamina. But you see, Eric played his cards right. He took his weaknesses into account. My glances at him during the game were fruitless because the boy more than likely already swiped the Game Boy mere seconds after I first ran onto the court. He speedrun swiped that shit for real, because to this day, I have no idea when he performed the actual theft. He was just biding time, already having the Game Boy in his pocket somewhere while keeping my jacket on the bleachers, pretending like he's watching the game and luring me into a false sense of security. He made no sudden moves towards the pockets of both my jacket and his own. In fact, he pretended like he was falling asleep from boredom, and a few minutes later, dude legit looked like he was just napping, still and stiff. I hope that boy grew up to be an actor or something, because that shit was scarily convincing. So I took my attention off him completely for a full minute, because them boys were tearing me up on that court, and that's all Eric needed. I shot a glance at the bleachers, then darted to them immediately when I saw that my jacket was the only thing there and no Eric in sight. Boy shot out of there like a Looney Tunes character, roadrunner the hell out of there before I even knew it. The boys on the court were pissed at me, but man, that spine grew thick enough for me to tell them to shut up as I ran around, searching for Eric as I felt the emptiness of my jacket. I figured he'd have run and hidden himself somewhere in the locker room, for I'm sure Eric knew he'd be caught by someone if he just stormed out of PE the way he did. So I ran in the back, mad beyond belief, both at the little thief and at myself for being so gullible in that moment of weakness. I shouted, Eric, you son of a bitch, where you at? But to no avail. Funnily enough, days after this happened, a classmate approached me about this, claiming he heard me while he was changing somewhere nearby. I'd imagine it being super hilarious hearing someone just shout out, Eric, you son of a bitch, in the background while he's trying to get dressed. The dude told me, damn boy, you sounded like you were about to throw down some hands. I ain't think you had that dog in you like that. I miss Anthony, man. He was a cool and funny kid. But I mean, it was kind of true though. I kept myself suppressed most of the time, both to stay out of trouble, and I just hated violence in general due to things I've witnessed way too young. I've been in fights before, and I've lost almost all of them due to pulling my punches. I remember being a laughingstock for a while for being beaten up by someone perceived as quote unquote weak. But it was precisely because that boy was frail that the mere thought of me hurting him turned my stomach upside down. And it was the same way with Eric. I needed to calm down because I knew a kid like that wouldn't be able to take a punch. Eric wasn't in the locker room though, so he really did take that risk and booked it out of there. Good on him, because I definitely wasn't calm enough to hold back any fists. And once that bell rang about 10 minutes later, as the boys were coming back in to change into uniform, I had to give Eric his props again. He was keeping tabs on the time. He knew that school was almost over, so darting out the actual gym so close to 2:25 was genius. I had no idea what bus the kid rode, and he had to have been long gone by then. So I'm like, damn it, he got my game. I had to keep my head on straight because I quickly realized that despite Eric's well-crafted plan, his endgame was weak as fuck. Yeah, he got away, but what he failed to take into account was that he was the only kid at school that knew I had a Game Boy. And while I didn't exactly see when he swiped it, he was the only one with the knowledge that my Game Boy was in my jacket. But telling the teachers wouldn't work because 1, they just didn't give a shit about us, and 2, they wouldn't have taken action anyway because they just say, well, you weren't supposed to have stuff like that on campus anyway. Which is true. Bringing my Game Boy to a school of known thieves was such a stupid idea in hindsight. And I knew teachers confiscated items that were deemed inappropriate for school, so reporting it wouldn't get it back. Especially since Eric could just keep the thing at home and feign ignorance. And then my only option presented myself. Oh man, I have to tell my parents. My stomach sank deep into the abyss after I thought of that. If I just let it go and allowed Eric to keep it, which is what I was heavily resigned to, my parents would have eventually gotten on my case and asked me where the Game Boy was. And I didn't want to go down that route. I was already going to get chewed out for bringing it to school in the first place, so the very idea of being punished further scared me. So after Eric got away, I sucked it up, went straight home, and told them exactly what happened. I was fully prepared to get the scolding of my life. While they did get a little angry at me for bringing it to school, their reaction was far from what I expected. And this, folks, is where things get insane. They didn't even bring up the fact that I should have known better, given the whole reason I had the new SP and 03 was due to the previous theft. My dad instead asked me, what's his name? I told him, but then I was immediately like, but why though? He didn't say anything, just resigned to silence with a face that looked as if he were ready to punch a wall. My mom came back from the living room because she left a bit while dad was questioning me. Then she approached the table and, I kid you not, Mama slammed down the yellow pages, and I'm like, but why though? She pulled out a whole phone book. Yeah, back in the day when we actually still use those. What's the boy's last name? My mama asked. I was hesitant because I was thinking to myself, they're not gonna do what I think they're gonna do, right? Right? She was getting a little impatient with my silence, so I just went on and told her. This further exposed Eric's weak endgame because his last name wasn't a common one down in the deep south. So if either of his parents were in the book, 9 times out of 10 my parents had the right number. Only one person with the last name was in the book, so all I remember was my mom telling both my dad and I to get ready and go to the car while she dialed the number. Thankfully they didn't take any weapons with them, so that put the worst fears to rest. I was pretty relieved to know that my folks weren't going to be complete psychopaths over a game. My mom was through at her call though, confirmed it was Eric's mom, and while I was strapping myself in with the seatbelt, I'm just thinking to myself, are we really going to do this? Dad starts driving, we get on one of the main roads, and I'm still in the back seat, shaking a little bit and saying to myself, we're actually doing this, huh? More minutes pass, and we're in another neighborhood I'm unfamiliar with. Despite their upset mood, it was becoming more clear that my parents were going to approach this peacefully, but I was still worried because you don't just show up to some folks' house that you don't even know like that, you know? My hometown was awful with crime way before all of America turned into this shit fest it is now, but for all we knew, Eric's mom was probably a lunatic luring us there to her house. We'd had no idea what she'd greet us with when she'd open that door. This was the hood we're talking about after all, because Eric lived closer to us than I thought. But Dad pulled into Eric's mom's driveway and it was sinking in properly. Yeah, we're actually doing this. Mom rang the doorbell, and I'm standing behind them both, shivering oh so subtly like it's still winter. Then Eric's mom, a rather hunched over, haggard looking lady who I'm sure was younger than she actually looked. It felt like I was stuck in some sort of time loop because it didn't seem like her conversation with my parents was progressing anywhere. Almost like they were just stuck in this loop of, hey, my son says that your son stole from him. We're just here to get it back and go back home. And Eric's mom is like, well, like I said on the phone. I ain't see Eric with anything after he came home. Why'd you think he stole it? Stuff like that. And I had to finally say something to tell her that Eric was the only person I knew that had it, and the last person to touch my jacket within the span of the 10 minutes that I was away from it. So after some time passed, his mom finally stopped playing 20 questions and walked back inside, telling us to wait a moment. Well, that moment was more like 5 minutes. So I'm getting nervous again because I've got this crazy imagery in my head of this lady creeping about in her house, loading up a shotgun and getting ready to blow our fucking brains out. And with that in mind, I was ready to just apologize to my parents and was just thinking of ways to plead with them to just get back into the car and go back home. If Eric taught me anything, it's that appearances can be very deceiving. This lady may look frail and tired, but that little deviant hellspawn of hers had to get that cunning from somewhere, you know? But before I could even open my mouth, the unthinkable happened. The door reopened. His mom emerged with a glare, but she had her fingers clenched onto my Onyx Black Game Boy SP. She apologized for everything, saying she made sure that he wasn't going to do something like that ever again. She then gave me my Game Boy back personally, bit down a bit to my level, looked me right in the eye, and said, "I can tell your mama and daddy worked hard to buy this for you, and they love you a lot to come up to my house like this. Be good, and don't bring it to that school ever again. You lucky it was my boy and not some little thug. Don't give your folks no more trouble." And that hit a little different, you know? Because I can tell the lady was struggling, and her home, which was on the verge of being considered dilapidated, hinted at that. She had absolutely nothing to gain by giving my Game Boy and 03 back, which I checked and saw that it was all still in the cartridge. She could have lied and said Eric just didn't have it, just to let her boy have something that she probably couldn't afford to give him. All it took was one peep into the house from her front door to realize what Eric's living conditions were like. Despite the situation I can only assume she and her son were in, the lady must have had a good heart. Sure, my parents parroted some of what she said to me on the drive back home, but for the most part, they didn't do much to me after that. I guess because they could tell I had already known how much I fucked up, and the whole ordeal was stressful enough to be its own form of punishment, to serve as a memory to look back on and even reflect on what Eric's mom told me. And as I look back on that as an adult now, it truly reaffirmed that my parents are fucking awesome, man. They did something no parent really shouldn't have done. Under most circumstances, especially in these tumultuous times we live in today, absolutely nobody should go to this extent to retrieve something stolen. Eric's mom was right. Had it been another kid who was a little thug instead, that could have gone horribly wrong for all three of us. A lot of thugs come from households that created their behavior, so with the insight into the type of environment I grew up in, I'll leave the rest of your imagination as to how that could have gone south. I'm not making excuses for Eric, by the way, because I know some smart ass watching this will find some of the smallest things to criticize me for. Despite someone's situation, stealing or any other type of crime, small or large, is wrong. But I still deserve to be punished too. Not getting my Game Boy back would have been a great punishment, for my parents worked too damn hard for their money. And me just thinking my little tactics could bypass the rules and ignoring the risks of my environment just to satiate my little addiction to Mega Man 03 was very disrespectful to the two people I love the most in this world. The very people who blessed me with the things I loved. With that in mind, despite them doing something I would not recommend any parent do, it was a true eye-opener that I took them for granted. I know some people don't have the best home life and even have some pretty awful parents, but just because someone gave birth to you doesn't mean they automatically deserve respect. Some disgusting people really take advantage of their children's obligations to them, and a lot of people out there really do not deserve to have kids. I'm just keeping it real. But for those who have parents that clearly care for you, honor them to the highest degree. This is hard for younger folks to grasp right away, as it's typically difficult for them to comprehend the challenges of parenthood. Some parents are simply more tough-lovey than others. Mine were a mix of tough love, but still showed their love with action instead of words. And I'm glad that in my 20s, I fully understood how blessed I am to have parents like them. I used to misunderstand a lot of things about them, but as I grew over the years and experienced life for myself, I just got where they were coming from, you know? I'm especially glad to know this before anything unfortunate could ever befall them, such as sickness or some kind of freak accident. I will honor them even beyond our graves. And I encourage you to do the same with your own parents if they're still here in this world. Do it before it's too late. If you don't have absolute scumbags for parents and things are just rocky instead, I urge you to just look back on everything and reevaluate. Give it another chance. Talk to them even. Maybe your parents were hard on you, but it wouldn't hurt to figure out why. Parents aren't perfect in their methods, but the genuine ones out there are doing the best they can. If you're a parent watching this though, do not visit someone's house like this in today's story. Get the school or authorities involved instead, especially if you live in a bad area. But yeah, that's it. Stay chill, y'all.